Amara Johnson crossed the marble lobby of One World Trade Center in New York, clutching a rain-soaked briefcase, her bare feet slipping on the icy floor. 50 perfect candidates in designer suits stared at her in horror. She had lost her only decent shoes on the subway, but she couldn't miss the last interview of her life. What no one knew was that 3 years earlier she had lived in a $12 million mansion in Manhattan and studied at Columbia Business School. Now she lived in a shared apartment in the Bronx, and her real name was a deadly secret. Because Amara Johnson was the daughter of Marcus Johnson, former partner of William Hayes, who died under mysterious circumstances after discovering a scheme that would have destroyed the billionaire CEO's empire. She was there for one reason only: to take revenge on the man who had killed her father and destroyed her family. But when their eyes met in the lobby, something unexpected happened that would change both their destinies forever. 3.5 years before that interview, Amara Johnson woke up at 2:30 a.m. to the sound of alarms blaring throughout the family's Upper East Side penthouse. Her father Marcus, a brilliant financial analyst and founding partner of Hayes & Associates, woke her up with panic written all over his face. He placed a backpack and a flash drive in her hands, tears streaming down his dark cheeks. He had discovered the truth about Hayes Holdings' fraudulent investments. 19 families of retirees had lost all their savings in fake funds, pyramid schemes disguised as safe investments for Black and Latino working-class communities. FBI cars surrounded the building as federal agents stormed the lobby. Marcus pushed Amara toward the fire escape, yelling at her to run to her grandmother Dorothy's house in Queens and not to trust anyone until Hayes was behind bars. It was the last time she saw her father alive. The next day, all the news outlets reported the same story: Marcus Johnson had jumped from the roof after discovering he was going to be arrested for fraud. But Amara knew the truth. Hayes had eliminated him so he couldn't testify against him. The following months were a brutal free fall. The family's assets were seized by the federal government. Her mother Keisha fell into a deep depression and was admitted to a clinic in upstate New York, leaving Amara completely alone at 19. The young woman who 3 months earlier had an unlimited black card and a private driver now worked as a food delivery driver for Uber Eats during the day and cleaned offices at night, sharing a cramped room with 2 other girls in the South Bronx. But every night, before collapsing from exhaustion onto her second-hand bunk bed, she swore revenge against William Hayes. For 2.5 years, she obsessively studied his every move, every dirty deal, every weak point in the empire he had built on the shattered dreams of 19 working families. When she saw the ad for a senior executive assistant at Hayes Holdings, she knew it was her golden opportunity. She created a completely false identity: Amara Williams, daughter of a Bronx cleaning lady and a bus driver, forged references from non-existent jobs, and prepared to infiltrate the life of the man who had ruined hers. The morning of the interview had one crystal-clear goal: to get into the rotten core of Hayes Holdings, win the enemy's trust, and then destroy him from within with the evidence her father had died protecting. But as she ran through the December storm to reach One World Trade Center, her thrift store shoe, the only decent pair she owned, completely fell apart on the subway stairs at Canal Street. For a moment, she considered giving up. How could she show up barefoot for the most crucial interview of her 3-year mission of revenge? Then she thought of her father, of the 19 families who had lost everything, of the children who couldn't go to college because their family savings had disappeared in Hayes schemes. She thought of the oath of justice she had made in the Queens Cemetery, kneeling in the rain before the simple headstone that was all they could afford. She took off her other mangled shoe and ran barefoot through the icy streets of Manhattan, ignoring the shocked stares of hurried New Yorkers. Nothing, absolutely nothing, would stop her from reaching this final reckoning with fate and with the man who had destroyed her family. The Hayes Holdings lobby on the 85th floor was an obscene cathedral of unbridled capitalism. Bone-white Carrara marble, contemporary art valued at millions of dollars, Austrian crystal chandeliers that cost more than entire houses in Queens. The air conditioning was so high that Amara felt her bare feet tingle in the cold, but that was insignificant compared to the ice in the eyes of the other 50 candidates. They were all perfect in ways she could never be: MBAs from Harvard and Wharton, pedigrees from the American white elite, immaculate resumes filled with internships at investment banks and powerful family connections. Suits that cost more than her 3 months' rent in the Bronx, designer handbags, discreet but expensive jewelry, perfect manicures, hair that had clearly cost hundreds of dollars at Madison Avenue salons. And then there was her, Amara Johnson disguised as Amara Williams, the glaring anomaly, the audacious outsider who had dared to step into that sanctuary of high finance with bare feet muddy from the street, carrying a $15 faux leather briefcase bought in a desperate sale in the Bronx. Her outfit was the best she owned: a black polyester blazer she had bought at Goodwill, a skirt she had shortened herself, a white blouse that was already yellowing under the armpits despite her best efforts. The receptionist, a platinum blonde with a diamond ring bigger than a grape and acrylic nails that could be used as weapons, slowly examined her from her bare feet to her wet briefcase with a kind of thinly veiled disdain that Amara had learned to recognize since childhood. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here," without uttering a single word. "Name?" The question came out like a bark. "Amara Williams," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her pounding heart. The receptionist checked her list with obvious distaste, as if the name itself were a stain on the perfect page. "Last row, seat 50. She pointed to a row of leather chairs in the far corner of the lobby, as if Amara's presence might contaminate the other candidates if she sat too close. Amara walked over with her head held high, feeling all eyes glued to her like poisonous honey. Some candidates whispered among themselves, malicious giggles that she pretended not to hear. Does she even have a degree? She probably came from the streets. How embarrassing for the company. Each word was a stab, but she had endured worse things over the past 3 years. She sat down in the designated chair and mentally reviewed her fabricated story for the 1000th time. Amara Williams, 22, daughter of a black cleaning lady named Dorothy Williams and a Puerto Rican bus driver named Carlos Williams, both completely fictional characters. First in her family to graduate from college, Hunter College, not Columbia, working 3 jobs to pay off student loans that didn't actually exist. She lived with her mother in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, dreaming of working on Wall Street to help her community gain access to financial opportunities. It was a perfectly plausible story, carefully constructed to elicit both pity and admiration, while keeping her completely disconnected from Marcus Johnson, whom Hayes believed he had eliminated along with all his dangerous secrets. At 4:15 p.m., the golden doors of the private elevator opened with a soft whisper, and out emerged the man who had haunted every one of her nightmares for 3.5 years. William Hayes, at 45, was more intimidating in person than on the covers of Forbes and Fortune. Tall, at least 6 feet 3 inches, gray hair perfectly styled by a $200 barber, navy blue Italian suit that cost more than many good people's annual salary. But it was his eyes that really disturbed her. Steel gray, calculating, predatory, the eyes of a shark who had built an $8 billion empire by trampling anyone who dared to stand in his bloody path. She had studied every photograph of him available online, analyzed every interview, memorized every facial expression. But nothing had prepared her for the actual physical presence of the man who had ruined her life. When his gaze landed on Amara's bare feet, she braced herself for public humiliation or icy contempt. Instead, she saw something completely unexpected. Genuine interest shining in those predatory eyes, perhaps even respect. Not condescending pity or cruel amusement, but something that seemed dangerously close to admiration. Hayes approached with the absolute confidence of someone who had never doubted his place at the top of the global food chain. Each step echoed on the marble like a declaration of power. His voice, when he finally spoke, was surprisingly warm. None of the icy tone she had imagined belonged to a cold-blooded killer. "You must be Amara Williams," he said, extending a hand that was probably worth more than all the money she had ever seen in her life. "William Hayes. Pleased to meet you." For a second, just a second, that genuine half-smile made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Then she remembered the flash drive hidden in her underwear, the photos of the 19 ruined families she had memorized, the tears of despair she had shed alone at her father's cheap funeral. Hatred burned in her veins again like liquid fire distilled from 3 years of obsessive planning. "Let's talk in my office," Hayes said, his eyes still fixed on hers with that disturbing intensity. "I hope you don't mind the view." William Hayes' office occupied 2 entire floors of the skyscraper, connected by a glass and steel spiral staircase that seemed to float in the air. The panoramic windows offered a literally breathtaking 360-degree view of Manhattan, the Empire State Building, Central Park, the Hudson River winding like a silver snake between the buildings. The decor screamed absolute power, a massive ebony desk that cost more than a luxury car, Italian leather chairs that looked like thrones, original artwork on the walls that Amara recognized from art history books. She settled into the armchair indicated, desperately trying to calm her heart, which was beating like an African war drum. This was the moment of the most important performance of her life, to convince the man who had destroyed her family that she was just another young black woman desperate for a chance to escape poverty. Hayes sat behind the desk, his hands folded with the precision of a surgeon. He picked up her fake resume, printed on plain paper at a corner print shop in the Bronx, and studied it with the intensity of a general analyzing battle plans. Every line, every word, every comma was scrutinized by those steely eyes that had built an empire through the ability to read people like open books. Amara Williams, he said slowly, savoring the fake name. Daughter of Dorothy Williams, cleaning lady, and Carlos Williams, bus driver. First in her family to graduate from college, Hunter College, majoring in business administration with student loans she's still paying off. Zero experience in the elite corporate world. He looked up. On paper, you're exactly the last person who should be in this room. The phrase was a careful trap, Amara realized. He was testing how she would react to the provocation, whether she would lose her composure or stand her ground. She had rehearsed this response 1,000 times in the cracked mirror of the shared bathroom in her Bronx apartment. You're right, she said, keeping her voice steady. I don't have the pedigree of the other candidates. I didn't go to Harvard or grow up in Westchester. But I know things they'll never know. Like what? I know what real hunger is. Not the metaphorical hunger for ambition that these girls pretend to understand when they talk about being hungry for success in their MBA essays. I know real hunger, the kind that teaches you to count every penny, to value every crumb of opportunity, to fight tooth and nail for every small victory. Hayes leaned forward slightly, clearly intrigued. The Manhattan socialites in the lobby know how to navigate gala dinners and charity events, Amara continued, but they will never understand the brutal real needs of the clients who really matter. People like me, like my family, like my community. People who need someone to understand their stories, their struggles, their dreams, in order to truly help them. And you think you can do that? I know I can. Because I've lived it. Every rejection, every door slammed in my face, every look of contempt. I know exactly how they feel when they walk into a bank and are treated as if they were invisible or dangerous. I know what it means to have to prove that you belong somewhere, every day, over and over again. Hayes was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming softly on the ebony table. Then he stood up and walked over to the large windows that framed the city he had helped shape with his questionable business dealings. Manhattan stretched out at his feet like a conquered empire. When he turned back to her, Amara saw something in his expression she hadn't anticipated. Not the cold arrogance or calculating cynicism she had expected, but a deep, almost existential exhaustion. Like someone who had won every important war but lost essential parts of his soul in the process. You know, Amara, he said slowly, most people on this floor never had to prove anything to anyone. They were born with safety nets, with connections, with a certainty that there would always be another opportunity if the first one didn't work out. That makes them limited. They know how to play the game, but they don't understand why the game exists. She nodded cautiously, unsure where he was taking the conversation. I'm going to make you an unusual offer, Hayes continued. 2 weeks to develop a strategy that could revolutionize some aspect of this company's operations. It could be anything: marketing, human resources, customer relations, technological innovation. If you genuinely impress me, the position is yours. If not, he shrugged. Well, at least you'll have an interesting story to tell. Amara felt her heart race. It was the golden opportunity she had waited 3 years for: unrestricted access to Hayes Holdings' internal systems, confidential files, all the evidence she needed to expose the crimes her father had been silenced for. I accept, she said without hesitation. Excellent. My current assistant, Sandra, will give you a temporary access card and explain our systems. You will have a desk on the 82nd floor and permission to speak with any employee in any department. Use this time wisely. During the intense 2 weeks that followed, Amara transformed herself into an elite spy operating under perfect cover. She arrived every day at 6:30 a.m., before any executives showed up, and left after 11 p.m., when even the most dedicated workaholics had gone home. She mapped out every department, talked to dozens of employees, and searched desperately for definitive proof of Hayes' systemic corruption. But what she discovered left her deeply and dangerously confused. Instead of the nest of criminal vipers she expected to find, Amara discovered a company that, despite all its problems and contradictions typical of the corporate world, treated its employees with unusual decency. Salaries were 15% above the market average. The health plan covered not only employees, but spouses, children, and even elderly parents. There was a scholarship program that paid for full college tuition for employees' children, regardless of family income. An emergency fund offered interest-free loans to families in crisis. There was even a psychologist available free of charge to any employee who needed one. How could the same man who had orchestrated the systematic destruction of 19 working families show such humanity toward his own employees? The cognitive dissonance was making her head spin dangerously. Every night she returned to her cramped apartment in the Bronx more confused than before, obsessively replaying every conversation, every document, every interaction. On the 8th day, while analyzing financial reports in a desperate attempt to find obvious irregularities, she had a revelation that would completely change her perspective. The problem wasn't in the numbers, it was in their human interpretation. Hayes Holdings was bleeding money due to enormous inefficiencies in communication between departments, but not because of malice or deliberate incompetence. It was a matter of people simply not being able to understand each other across the hierarchical, cultural, and social barriers that divided the organization like an invisible chasm. Executives on the 85th floor spoke a completely different language than supervisors on the 30th floor, who in turn were unable to communicate effectively with operational staff on the lower floors. Amara spent the next 6 days working 18 hours a day on the most revolutionary proposal she had ever conceived. It was a cross-mentoring system that would connect veteran executives with emerging talent from completely diverse backgrounds, breaking down the invisible barriers that prevented true collaboration. The project would increase productivity by 35% while creating a genuinely more inclusive and humane culture. But there was more. Her personal experience navigating different social worlds, from the wealth of Manhattan to the poverty of the Bronx, gave her a unique perspective on how to build bridges between classes and cultures. She proposed a pilot program where employees from all levels would work together on community projects, developing empathy and mutual understanding through shared experiences. On the 14th day, Amara showed up at Hayes' office with a 50-slide presentation and cold, sweaty palms. She had created the most innovative work of her life to deceive the man she hated, but as she began to speak, she realized something disturbing. Every word sprang from genuine convictions about how to make the corporate world more just and humane. Hayes listened to her in religious silence throughout the 45-minute presentation. He took notes in a leather notebook, interrupting only occasionally to ask technical questions that revealed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of issues of diversity, social inclusion, and organizational psychology. His questions were not those of a sociopath interested only in profit, but of someone genuinely committed to creating a fairer work environment. "How would you measure the success of this program?" he asked. "Not just through quantitative metrics such as productivity and employee retention," Amara replied, "but through qualitative indicators. Personal stories of growth. Connections formed between people who would normally never speak to each other. Changes in the language people use to refer to each other. What if some executives resist? Then we identify why they are resisting. Fear of losing power? Discomfort with change? Unconscious biases? Every resistance is a learning opportunity, not an insurmountable obstacle." When she finished, Hayes remained silent for minutes that felt like hours. His hands were folded, his eyes fixed on the last page of the presentation. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. Then he smiled, not a calculating or condescending smile, but something that seemed genuinely impressed. "Amara," he said slowly, "I've just witnessed the most visionary presentation I've heard in the last 10 years. But there's a problem." Her heart sank. "It's too revolutionary to be implemented by a junior executive assistant." He opened a drawer and took out a contract he had already prepared. "You have just been promoted to Director of Organizational Innovation, with a starting salary of $85,000 per year and complete autonomy to turn your ideas into reality." Leaving that meeting 20 minutes later, Amara was more confused than when she had arrived barefoot 2 weeks earlier. She had gotten exactly what she needed: unrestricted access to the deepest secrets of Hayes Holdings. But the man who had just promoted her did not remotely resemble the monster she had built up in her mind during 3 years of obsessive hatred. He seemed genuinely committed to social justice, intelligent enough to recognize brilliance regardless of its origin, and surprisingly vulnerable behind all that armor of power and wealth. How could he be both the visionary who had just given her the opportunity of a lifetime and the sociopathic killer who had destroyed her family? In the months that followed, as his mentoring program began to transform Amara into the company's brightest star, her secret investigation finally revealed a truth that completely shattered her perception of reality. The files Amara finally managed to access in her 10th month on the job revealed a truth more devastating than any lie she had ever imagined. Hayes had, in fact, desperately tried to protect the 19 families. When he discovered the irregularities in the retirement funds, he had immediately hired an independent audit from an outside firm. He had alerted federal regulatory authorities. He had even used $12 million of his personal resources in an attempt to compensate the victims before they lost everything. But the scheme had been orchestrated with surgical precision by Amara Johnson, his own father, who had used his position of absolute trust as a founding partner to systematically steal the retirement funds of working families over a 2-year period. Families who trusted him because they shared the same skin color, the same history of struggle, the same dreams of honest prosperity. Recordings of the emergency meetings showed Hayes begging Marcus to confess and quietly return the money, even offering to cover the losses with his own funds to prevent families from being destroyed. Instead of accepting the honorable way out, Marcus had chosen suicide, leaving Hayes to bear the public blame for a crime he had desperately tried to prevent. One Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after his promotion, Hayes showed up at her office with 2 organic coffees and a confession that devastated her emotionally. He closed the door, sat down in the chair across from her desk, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked truly vulnerable. "I need to tell you something I've never told anyone," he began, his hands trembling slightly as he held the coffee. "I lost my own parents to a Ponzi scheme when I was 25. They lost literally everything: their home, their savings, their dignity. My mother died of a heart attack 3 months after they learned there was nothing left. My father drank himself to death 2 years later." Amara felt the world sway around her. "That's why I built so many layers of protection into this company. Triple audit systems, separation of duties, automatic alerts for any suspicious transactions. I thought I had made it impossible for anyone to do to our client families what they did to mine." He paused, swallowing hard. "I was wrong. Mr. Hayes. I know who you are, Amara. I always have." His words hit her like a bolt of lightning. "Amara Johnson, daughter of Marcus Johnson, not Williams. You have his eyes, the same way you frown when you're concentrating. And most of all, you have the same pain I recognized the first second I saw you in that lobby." The silence that followed was so thick she could hear it. "Why didn't you fire me?" she finally whispered. "Because you deserved to know the truth. Not through my words, which you might think were lies to protect myself, but through personal discovery. I wanted you to find the documents, listen to the recordings, see with your own eyes who your father really was in the last years of his life." Tears began to roll down her face uncontrollably. "Your father was brilliant, Amara. One of the smartest men I've ever known. But something broke in him when his family started having financial problems after your mother's cancer diagnosis. Pride, perhaps. Desperation. I don't know. It started small, just a few $1,000s borrowed from the funds, thinking he could replace it before anyone noticed. But he couldn't. No. And when the hole got too big to hide, instead of asking for help, he dug deeper. When I finally found out, it was almost $8 million. I offered to cover it all, but he couldn't live with the shame of betraying the people who trusted him most." That night, Amara cried for hours in the quiet Bronx apartment, mourning not only 3.5 wasted years hating the wrong man, but also the idealized image she had held of her father. Marcus Johnson was not the upright hero who had died fighting injustice. He was a broken man who had made desperate choices and then couldn't live with the consequences. But at dawn, she made the most important decision of her life. She would be completely honest with Hayes and channel all her destructive energy into something genuinely constructive. The following Monday, she marched into Hayes's office with trembling hands but unwavering determination. She confessed everything: her true identity, the 3 years she had spent planning her revenge, the devastating discovery about her father's crimes, the emotional journey that had taken her from a thirst for vengeance to an understanding of human complexity. She expected immediate dismissal, perhaps even legal proceedings for identity fraud. Instead, Hayes listened to her with the deep compassion of someone who had walked through a similar hell and lived to tell the story. "I recognized the pain in your eyes from the first moment I saw you barefoot in the lobby," he said softly. "It's the same pain I carried for decades after losing my parents. The pain of someone who had their reality shattered and had to rebuild a completely new identity from the pieces." Hayes opened a drawer and took out a sealed envelope with her real name handwritten on it. "I prepared this 6 months ago, when I was sure who you were." Inside was an official job offer: Executive Director of the Hayes Foundation for Financial Justice, with an annual budget of $50 million and an explicit mission to protect vulnerable families from predatory fraud schemes. Marcus was brilliant, but he chose the wrong path when he was pressured by circumstances, Hayes explained. You have the same intelligence, but you can channel it to protect people instead of harming them. The best way to honor your father's complicated memory would be to ensure that other families never go through the hell yours did. Amara signed the contract with tears streaming down her face. Not just a job, but a mission that finally gave genuine meaning to years of suffering. When she asked how he had managed to forgive someone who had come there with the explicit intention of destroying him, Hayes replied with wisdom gained through decades of constructively processed pain. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending the pain didn't exist. It means transforming that pain into a purpose greater than our personal thirst for revenge. Over the next 2 years, Amara transformed the Hayes Foundation into the national model for financial consumer protection. Her first major victory was dismantling a network of Ponzi schemes that specifically targeted Latino immigrant communities and working-class Black families, saving more than 1,200 families from losing their life savings. During the press conference announcing the 23 arrests, she gave an interview that went viral nationwide and changed the conversation about white-collar crime in America. "I'm not just protecting people from outside criminals," she explained to CNN cameras. "I'm protecting them from their former selves, young people filled with anger and pain who could make destructive choices if they don't find constructive ways to process generational and personal trauma." Hayes watched from the front row with paternal pride stamped on his face, seeing the young woman who had arrived barefoot transform into one of the most powerful and respected voices in the country advocating for economic justice for marginalized communities. Media success made Amara a reluctant celebrity, the cover of Time as Person of the Year, invitations to speak at Harvard and Stanford, offers of million-dollar contracts for books and documentaries. But what really mattered to her were the tangible results: 2,300 families saved from predatory financial scams, 400 young people from underserved communities receiving full college scholarships, 67 white-collar criminals finally facing real consequences for their crimes against working families. Hayes fulfilled her promise to gradually step away from lucrative business ventures to focus entirely on transformative philanthropy. Her book Second Chances: How to Turn Trauma into Purpose became a New York Times #1 bestseller for 18 consecutive weeks, with all royalties going toward expanding the foundation to 20 additional states. In the book's introduction, there was a dedication that made Amara cry every time she reread it, to Amara Johnson, who taught me that the most deeply wounded people often become the best healers, if we give them the opportunity and support to transform their pain into a purpose greater than themselves. Her mother Keisha, finally recovered after years of intensive therapy, came to live near her in Brooklyn and worked as a volunteer counselor at the foundation, helping other families who had lost everything to rebuild their lives with their dignity intact. Hayes found true love with Dr. Angela Martinez, a pediatrician who ran free clinics in underserved communities funded entirely by him. On the 3rd anniversary of the day she arrived barefoot for the interview, Amara received a mysterious package with no return address. Inside were her original shoes, which had broken on the subway stairs, completely restored by an Italian shoemaker and polished like black mirrors. They were accompanied by a handwritten note on letterhead, to remind you that sometimes the most extraordinary miracles begin with a courageous and vulnerable step into the unknown. You have honored your father's memory in ways he could never have imagined, turning your personal tragedy into hope for thousands. With eternal admiration and respect, W. That afternoon, in her elegant but deliberately modest apartment in Park Slope, Brooklyn, Amara placed those repaired shoes in a prominent place on the living room shelf, not as a painful reminder of the poverty she had experienced, but as a powerful symbol of personal transformation and renewed purpose. The young girl who had arrived barefoot 3 years earlier, driven by destructive hatred and a thirst for revenge, had become a woman who built solid bridges between despair and genuine hope, between individual trauma and collective healing, between systemic injustice and the real possibility of transformative change. And whenever young people from marginalized communities visited the foundation seeking advice on how to overcome impossible circumstances, Amara would point to those shoes and tell the whole story, not just about arriving barefoot for an interview, but about how to transform life's worst experiences into fuel for creating a more just world for everyone.